Greetings, everybody. Welcome. I'm going to have a seat. Maybe that's not coming. Greetings, everyone. So beautiful to see you here. I'm Claire Sierra, and we are coming to you live in the parlor or library at the Balch Hotel in sunny Dufur, which is in the Columbia River Gorge in Oregon. If you're new to me here, that's one of the aspects of my life is as a hotel owner and a spa priestess. So welcome. And my vision for this gathering and how this came about happening is I, for a long time, have had a deep desire to have conversations with other authors. Since I wrote the Magdalene Path book in 2014, I have come to know a lot of people who are involved and interested in Mary Magdalene, as someone who's just presenced in the chat. And we are seeing a lot more of her coming into the fore. And I had a vision several months back about, wouldn't it be really interesting to come together to talk to some of these different authors? I have these kinds of conversations with people all the time, as I'm sure you do too, but to actually convene a circle, gather people together and record these conversations so that they're not just private conversations over cups of tea. Although we do have our cups of tea. And so, yes, so that's what we're here to do today. Ruth is a dear friend and colleague and mentor, and she just happened to be passing through the area. And so I said, well, since you're going to be here, how about we do this? So that's what brings us here. If you're not already muted and you're with us live, then if you could please go ahead and mute yourself, that would be helpful, because then we'll have a clean recording with no background noise.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I just thought we would start first by introducing ourselves a little bit. Mm-hmm. And as I just mentioned, I'm Claire Sierra, and I'm the author of the Magdalene Path, Awaken the Power of Your Feminine Soul. And my work is really all about the reclamation of the sacred feminine and for women's empowerment, for the upliftment of humanity. In other words, for the world. And I feel like this is an important and powerful time for us to be here together, to be gathering, and to be on this planet. And so that's a bit about who I am. Why don't you tell everybody that doesn't know you a bit about who you are?
Well, several people know me there, and that's lovely to see you. And as most women, I've been intrigued by that mystery woman, Mary Magdalene, right? All of my awareness of the Judeo-Christian tradition, it's there. And then in the early 2000s, that book came out called The Da Vinci Code, and a lot of people were asking questions. And a wonderful lady who's in the group named Martha said, we could go to France. And we went to France. Thank you. And we went and we spent quite a bit of time at Chartres, and then we went down to Provence. We got to go to the cave, if you will, at Saint-Aubin, which turns out to be large enough to hold a church and other things as well. It's a huge space. And it was very clear to me that had been an ancient teaching environment for a long time. Mm-hmm. So I was there to establish the historicity of the things that were said in the Da Vinci Code and establish that most of them were moderately okay. Mm-hmm. But then what I did is I realized that she fit into a historical and archaeological pattern that I had been working with for a long time. Mm-hmm. So my book, which is in the current edition called Madonna, Magdalene, and Beyond, addresses who they were really, and then looks at how their particular form of power was essential for Jesus's process, mm-hmm. his development, and everything that we hear about in the New Testament. Mm-hmm. And also it looks at the fact that the Madonna and the Magdalene got overlapped a lot in what was going on, right. And how the Magdalene got pushed aside from the central figures of Christianity, and how that was reflective of how women were being pushed aside from the centrality of Christianity.
Yeah.
And her emergence is going along with the dissolution of this culture that in the course of putting together this book, I began to call empire culture.
Mm-hmm.
So as the Magdalene reemerges, what we're saying is the values of that kind of being that she was and is are what are emerging. And for me, what I'm seeing is a whole new understanding of what power is through our understanding of the Magdalene.
So interesting, because as you're sharing about that, I'm realizing the commonalities of our stories, and there's differences too, which we'll explore today. And but I was really getting the guidance about Mary Magdalene and seeing who she is and what she's about, and is this really true, and all of that. My interest in her predates the Da Vinci Code, and sort of reading all the books of the likes of luminaries like Margaret Starbird and Karen King and others who have, Cynthia Bourgeot, who have all done amazing scholarship. And I too went to south of France because I felt like I want to see that there's this lore about her. What does it seem like there? What do they think there? And as I found, and as of course, and I know you found, and others as well who've been there, they certainly believe she was there. I mean, there's certainly plenty of evidence of that. But what was interesting for me, so then after that was when I came back and started receiving the downloads that became the Magdalene Path book. What a surprise. and and I write a lot in the book about my resistance to that and why I resisted that. And part of that was because she was such a cast out figure, and it goes so against the grain of, as you call it, dominant, what I would call dominant culture or empire culture, that I had my own sort of ego fears about what that would be. But what came through in the book very clearly was not just about Mary Magdalene, which is kind of what I thought the book would be about, but about how that relates to the balance of power, masculine and feminine, which I addressed in a very...
Somebody needs to mute her.
Please mute.
You can mute all.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and mute all. We're going to take care of it. Let's see. Nope, there's no mute all. Let's see. Under participants. There we go.
Thank you.
All right. So what I also discovered is this whole thing about the balance of power. It came through in a very sort of in a very different way, and yet it's a really similar theme that the masculine and the feminine are way out of balance. And my book is a lot about how we can rebalance that in ourselves. But of course, as we rebalance it in ourselves, we rebalance it in the world.
Right.
And so it kind of seems like your book in a way is looking at how that's in the world, and then how do we take that.
Right. Mine is much more of a scholarly book and less of a how-to book.
Yeah.
And yours is a wonderful how-to book.
Well, they're both good books. They're just different ways. They're both good. So I have a couple questions here, and we don't have to cover them all, but just maybe we could just talk briefly about who do you think Mary Magdalene really was? Like, what's missed in the mainstream narrative? Sure. And we could also talk about, maybe that'll bring up some of the differences that you and I share.
Of course. So historically, we've been told that this is a woman who came from the village of Magdala, which didn't exist during Augustine's empire.
I know.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a beautiful place, I'm sure. Well honoring her now.
Right. Yes.
But not where she lived.
Right. So that was an interesting thing. And one of the themes that I discovered in the process of putting this book together was that the word Mary, of course, comes from the Greek Mariam, which came from the Hebrew, which is M-R-Y-M. Okay, pronounced however you want to pronounce it, right? And it turns out that there's no Miriam in the Old Testament except Moses' sister, the one who led the dances after the Red Sea, the one who made sure that Moses got his mother as his wet nurse when the Pharaoh's daughter found him. Yeah, so she was a very powerful being, right?
Yeah.
And so Miriam in the Old Testament rises in power and then is shunned. And then we don't hear about her. But when she passes on, they name the sacred well after her.
And shows up later in the stories, perhaps.
Yeah. Not quite, but close enough. Yeah, it's absolutely metaphorically living water.
Yeah.
And so that was interesting. There's one in the Old Testament, but there is one other person. And the book of Ruth, for some reason, I'm familiar with.
How quirky of you.
And when Naomi returns to Bethlehem, where she is going to be, where she grew up, and where she returns after all of their men die in Moab, she brings her daughter-in-law, Ruth, with her. And she comes into town and she says, I'm not Naomi anymore. I am, and it's usually translated as M-R-Y. Not M-R-Y-M. But I started looking at that. That's the same name in a slightly different form. And it's the only other time we see it. In all the Old Testament women, we never see that name again.
And in the New Testament, it's like every other woman is named Mary, and it makes it so confusing.
Right. There are 6 of them in the New Testament. Right. So I started looking at the 6 in the New Testament and looking at what Naomi, Miriam, was able to do in Bethlehem. She became the head woman. She may have been before she left. We don't know, but she definitely was. And she arranged for her daughter to become the head woman by linking her up with the head man.
Right.
Okay. So her daughter-in-law, Ruth. So, and then we get the lineage of Jesus from that. So that's, that's all very cool. So then I'm looking at the 6 Marys in the New Testament, who are all Miriam. And I'm also aware that the English name Jesus comes from the Latin and Greek Jesu, which comes from the Hebrew or the Aramaic nickname Jesu for the Hebrew word Joshua, that we pronounce Joshua. Okay, Yeshua, which means Savior of God.
Right.
Champion of God.
Yes.
Salvation of God. This is a title.
Right.
This is not a name. And I came to understand that Miriam is a title that you take on when you become the head woman. So that was part of it. Then there's another piece of all of this. Can
I just cut in there for a second? Because I think this is so interesting. Because even though I've done a lot of reading and a lot of research, when I wrote the Magdalene Path book, I wanted to receive that as purely as I could.
Sure.
And I wasn't doing reading. I wasn't doing research. A lot of the research I've done since, but at the time, not that much. And the message I really got so clearly was same thing. Mary was a title, not a name, which is why we see Mary this and Mary that. And so I think that's just interesting, the ways in which sometimes our intuitions or our divine guidances can then become borne out by scholarly research. And not that we need to have them proven by scholarly research, but it's kind of a nice,
absolutely,
it's a nice confirmation that we're kind of coming from a clear place and receiving things that are
I love hearing that.
Necessary.
Yes, love hearing that. So that's the first name. Then we have this other thing called Magdalene, and we know she's not from a village called Magdala. But in in Isaiah and in the other prophecies, in the coming times, we have something called the Magdal Eder, which is the watchtower. And the watchtower is in the vineyards and in the pastures. There is someone who watches to make sure the weather isn't changing, that there aren't locusts coming or whatever, right?
Right.
And it turns out that when Herod rebuilt Solomon's temple just before Jesus was born, he maintained the women's court in Solomon's temple, and the tallest tower on the temple grounds is called the Magdala Tower.
That's so interesting, because in the south of France, in Rennes-le-Château, that's they call it the Tour Mandala. Yes, that totally makes sense.
Exactly. So if you look at the New Testament, it looks as if women are not allowed in the temple, but Mary and Joseph both go to retrieve Jesus from the temple.
Right.
And when Jesus is taken for his introduction to the temple and Mary is going for her cleansing, a woman who spent her whole life in the temple,
yes,
named Anna, declared this is the Messiah.
Right.
A woman spent her whole life in the temple.
I know. Exactly. And that was the other piece. I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's the other piece that I had that came through that was, again, different from the common knowledge, was that there was an aspect of the temple where there were women. And then I later learned through another source as well, similar thing. It's in the Bible. Women are there, but somehow they just glance over that, like, don't pay attention here. We're talking about over here, off camera. So that's and so that's and that was the guidance I received, is that there were still temple practices going on. There were still temple priestesses. They probably, maybe they weren't being called priestesses at that time, but they were still.
We don't know.
Exactly.
But we do know there was a Magdal Tower. We do know that Magdal means tower, and the Magdal Eder is the watchtower. And we do know there are women in the temple. So what I started putting together with what was available from other sources was that there were head women in each of the village, and they would be schooled at the temple by a head woman, if you will. The Mary, who was the one who was the teacher of all.
The Magdalene of all the Marys.
Exactly. Right. The towering one. And if you look at the iconography for the Magdalene, she's always the tallest person present.
That's right.
Quite apart from all the other ones. But that one thing is there. She's always the tallest person. So that's part of what the name is about. Yeah. And in the Renaissance and medieval paintings, which is where they are trying to retain and convey this heretical information, there's often a tower behind her as well, similar kinds of things. Yes. So the Magdalene becomes the Miriam, who is the head woman of all the Miriams, and the teacher and the holder of the feminine power for the community. And that was what was in place before empires were formed. There was the woman who embodied the goddess, the woman who was the teacher of wisdom in the women's environment and in the women's aspect of the culture.
Right. Exactly. I couldn't agree more. I'm not sure I even have anything to add. I think that that's absolutely true. And it kind of comes to a question that was asked earlier about, and that I thought was that whole idea about why do we, and maybe this is a leading question, why do we think she's coming to the fore now? Because when I first started getting messages about Mary Magdalene, and when I became interested in her, like even in my interests predate the writing of the book, of course, and it was in the 90s, maybe even in the late 80s, maybe not, but nobody was talking about her, and certainly not in this way.
Except Margaret Starbird, thank heavens.
Yeah, exactly. Thank heavens for Margaret Starbird. Yeah. And so, so I thought it'd be fun for us to talk about what we think is happening for her, why we think she's coming to the fore now.
I have a fun thing. One of the things, Martha is such a great artist and such a great help. And one of the things we did is we managed to get a picture of a stained glass window that is the first one. You come in the main entrance to Chartres, and literally the first window on the right-hand side is the Mary Magdalene window. And it is the story that is the traditional story of the Magdalene being with Jesus, and then the Magdalene being in Egypt, and then the Magdalene being brought to Provence and getting off the ship and then teaching people in Provence. Right. That's what's in that window from 1190. Right. And that window, as all the windows in Chartres, have a little tiny circle down at the bottom that you can't see, but there's these little tiny circles at the bottom. And the guild that sponsored the window is in the little tiny circle. It's water bearers. Aquarius. So they knew at some level that the Magdalene was going to reemerge in the age of Aquarius, of the water bearers. And we know that they understood the zodiac because one of the entrances to Chartres Cathedral is surrounded by the zodiac with the appropriate activity for each sign. The other one is the liberal arts of the Greek mystery schools, and then the one in the middle is the apostles. So we know they understood what they were doing.
Yeah, well, and how could they not? They were earth-based people. They would need to, they need to know what's going on in the world around them. Yeah. I mean, I think that there's a lot of reasons that Mary Magdalene is coming to the fore now, but we're certainly in a time where we're seeing without looking too hard how out of balance things are. I mean, we can no longer, to my mind, we can no longer deny the effects and the impact and the happening of climate change. And when we look at that and we look at why that's happening, it's the overrunning of humanity in our current lifestyle, is particularly Caucasian, white humanity, white American humanity. And that's out of balance. I mean, we're out of balance. And when we look at, well, why are we out of balance? It's because we've had several thousand years of patriarchy, and women have been silenced. Women have been oppressed. Women have been kept from leadership and places of power. And so to me, when we bring back Mary Magdalene, we start to bring back the divine feminine in its most intrinsic form. I know we have a little visitor here. It's a little
spider woman
is joining us, exactly. Just prancing right across our space here.
I'm just making sure she stays on the table, not on me.
And so it just seems like when we lost Mary Magdalene, we lost the visible, tangible, and more real world based aspect of the sacred feminine, or ourselves as that one just wants to be on you. there I'm honored. There we go. You got a little spider kiss and off she runs. So whereas Mother Mary, who I also think, had a whole snow job done about her.
Oh, absolutely.
She really was. But the image and the vision that we get, the story we get about Mother Mary and who she was, is this very demure and very sweet, not eyes downcast and soft colors. And she's just so sweet and so nice and so innocent, and was so, dropped into this story unknowingly, which I don't think any of that is actually true.
Right. So somewhere along about 1200, the formation, actually it was earlier than that. I apologize. It was earlier than that. It was before, during the early parts of the Crusades, but the formation of the Dominican order included shifting the idea of feminine power from the Magdalene with royal blue and bright red and unbound hair and all those good things, hid her away in a sanctuary that still is not complete today, that was started at about 1100. The front of the building still is not finished, right? In Maximin. But then the image of the mother was given this very sweet, demure thing to replace this powerful feminine with this quiet, hidden feminine.
That's right.
And one of the things that happened shortly after that is the monasteries that had all been co-ed were now being separated, and so on. So it's a very interesting period during that time. And
not only were those cathedrals had been previously devoted to Our Lady was the Magdalene, and then they got shifted. But also Dominic, that's when Dominic of Dominicans, so they named it after him. He received the rosary and used the rosary to stamp out the heresy, to defeat the heresy. And when you read books about that, they don't ever really talk about what the heresy is. But of course, this is the heresy was the preeminence and the predominance of the Magdalene.
And one of the fun things that I've so appreciated is, in French, it's not Mary the Magdalene. It's Marie Magdalene. Okay. And it turns out that prior to about 1200, what we pronounce as an L in French was pronounced as an R, which makes her the Queen Mother.
Oh, Madame Ren, it would be Ren, not Ren. Oh, right. And doesn't that fit? And I wonder how that would be different in the Occitania language rather than the French language, which which all changed when all those folks came down and did their big takeover thing. And it's in their fabulous empire way. Yeah.
The thing about empire culture that I say is about every 200 years, one takes over another, and there's another wave, and there's another wave. It's all in the appendix in my book. But I took it from about 6000 BC to George W. Bush.
Yeah, only because you've been running out of time. You haven't had time to fill in the last bit, right? I want to just take a look at our time here. Now it's 9:45, so we have perhaps have a bit more time. Gosh, I'm wondering what question comes to your mind?
Well, we haven't talked about your experience and how you feel the Magdalene Path does what you would like it to be doing.
Oh, well, that's quite a question. So for me, receiving this book was such a great gift. And it was one that, frankly, I didn't come to so easily. I mean, I kind of did some kicking and screaming there, and I kind of remember. Yeah, you kind of remember. Yeah, exactly. And I'm glad I shared that part of the story, because I think sometimes we receive knowing about what we need to do, or who we're meant to be, or how we're meant to serve, or we're longing to know our purpose, and then we hear it and we go, oh, or no, it's sort of like it's a card catalog or a recipe. Like, no, not that purpose. I want a different purpose. And certainly we all have different ways that we can serve. We all have different ways that we can be contributing and doing our purpose. I don't necessarily believe that we have one thing that we're here particularly to do, but I do think that we probably have one strong thing, and that the lack of moving towards it, or the lack of embracing it, can cause a whole lot of heartache and misery. So part of the Magdalene Path book is really about helping women reclaim this idea that we are divine, and we were told for a long time that we were not divine. And I came to hear and understand as I wrote the book that we can't even in a way really realize the impact of that, because we've never had it. Yeah. And it's hard to know the impact of something that you've never had, but that is really the main thing. And that as women start to wake up, as we really start to wake up to the fact that we're really divine, then wow, what does that do? What does that mean? And how do we live in the world, and how do we live as part of the world? So part of what I've been getting lately, although it's definitely really seeded through the whole Magdalene Path book, is about the path of embodiment. And this is why I think the Magdalene is such a draw for so many of us, because we sense her earthy presence. We sense her earthy spirituality, her embodiment. She wasn't like an up and out sort of deity, that we're going to connect to in heaven, although we may connect to, but also this idea that heaven is here. Heaven is planet Earth. We are here to embody heaven on earth now. And that's not the message that we got through the mainstream Christianity. Mainstream Christianity is like, we're all sinners and we're all bad. And if you're feeling really bad about yourself, what are you going to want to do? You're not going to want to be here. You're going to want to escape. So we go up and out. And so many spiritual practices and processes of Western and Eastern spirituality are really about ascension. Whereas the Magdalene Path, I feel like, and the awakening of the divine feminine in general, is really about embodiment, coming into being here on the planet. And when we come into here and being on the planet, we then meet all the aspects of ourselves that have been unloved. And it's often about walking the path of love and healing our own trauma or challenges or woundings that we've had. in order to then more fully embody, so that we can start to recognize and start to really enact ways in which we can make magic in the world. You know, we can use the power of our thoughts, the power of our feelings, the power of our thinking, the power of our visioning, all of these amazing powers that we've been gifted with and that have been lying in many ways dormant. And I was so pleased when I met you. I initially met Ruth because one of Ruth's day jobs is as a Unitarian and Unity minister. And I met you when you were speaking at another form of New Thought Church called the Center for Spiritual Living, which is sometimes known as science of mind and sometimes known as religious science. And although that's not the same as Scientology, I would like to say, I like to always say that. So, you know, and that really marries in that whole law of attraction and how we use our imagination, our imaginal realm, to create the world that we're looking to create.
And I love hearing that. I absolutely love hearing that, because part of why I did the book that I did was I am convinced that their capacity, that the Marys as a group capacity to be that, is how Jesus could do what he did, right?
Yes.
And one of the points that I like to make is...
Can I just say, because they were there holding space throughout, which is why you see them mentioned in all of the books, right? Mm-hmm. Exactly. Mm-hmm. I just want to make that transparent for people. Right. They're the only ones at the foot of the cross. They're the only ones at this and that.
And the only ones at the tomb.
In the tomb, exactly.
Yeah. So, and they sustained the group. Yeah. With their sufficiency. The women had the capacity to support the group.
And they were bankrolling it as well. They weren't just
right. Yeah.
Exactly.
So that piece, but then we have another little piece. One of the popes, Gregory the Great, had this inspiration. He wrote a sermon on Magdalene's feast day that put the prostitute, the woman caught in adultery, and the woman who anointed Jesus' feet with her tears and her hair, all in one bag. Yeah. And so now the Magdalene is the prostitute. Right. Well, in Hebrew, the word that through the Greek, Latin, and English has been translated into prostitute, if it's in the masculine form, it means temple devotee.
Oh. Did you know that? I didn't know that.
Isn't that marvelous?
Oh my goodness.
So what we're saying is these women are the women of the temple.
Yeah.
These women are the embodiment of power on earth.
Don't look over here. Don't look over here. They're just sinful, shameful people. We don't want to pay attention to them.
So the whole point was to separate and to make the idea of being female not okay. Mm-hmm. And I think a huge part of what we've experienced, especially those of us who were paying attention in the 70s, is, wait a minute, women are okay. Yes. Yeah, right? For the first time. And we also have to recognize that prior to World War II, a marriage was a partnership. Mm-hmm. You know, the founders of the United States Ben Franklin spent 15 years away while his wife ran their business. Yeah. Right? John Adams spent the better part of 10 years, 6 to 9 months a year, helping to bring forth this nation, while Abigail homeschooled their kids and ran their farm. Right. Right. So we can see that over and over again, that in that time period, it was a partnership. And I spent my summers on a farm growing up. I got to know farm communities really well. And it's a partnership. There's the women's realm and the men's realm and the overlap. Yeah. And that kind of thing was normal, particularly prior to the 1960s. Mm-hmm. And then because of World War II, where people started getting distributed, prior to World War II in the US, 90% of people lived on self-sustaining farms.
So amazing.
By 1960, only 10% of our population did.
Wow.
And now it's down to about 5%.
Yeah.
Okay. That's part of the off balance that you were talking about earlier.
Right.
But in that environment, it's clearly a partnership.
Yeah.
That, neither one would survive without the other.
Right. Right.
And that's not something that post-World War II people understood,
Mm-hmm.
because we were given this image of the happy suburban housewife and the man going off into the real world.
Yeah, exactly. And that gives me a lot to chew on, especially since my husband and I own this hotel together, and we have at times run it together, and now things are shifting and separating. But what I'm also thinking about is how in the awakening of the women's movement in the 70s, how all of a sudden being part of it was how it was lensed, right? Instead of it being a partnership in both people, because of patriarchy being patriarchy, we don't hear about Abigail Adams as much as we hear about John. We don't hear about, I don't even know Ben Franklin's wife's name as much as Ben.
Good
right?
point.
And so the women were sort of disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in the 70s, and certainly since then, women are like, well, wait a minute, I deserve some recognition, or I deserve to show up.
Mm-hmm.
And I have my own thing to do. I don't necessarily want to do the thing that you want to do.
Right. And so what I think all the Marys do really is give us a way to think about how to be powerful in our own right without necessarily becoming men.
Yes. And also, I think there's a meta message there about one of the ways to do that is by coming together, which is part of why you are all here today, so that we can be building this energy, so that we can be receiving this energy, and we can recognize that, oh, I'm not, I'm in my own, I'm in my own world, in my own place, and it can feel like lonely and isolated.
Yeah.
But we don't have to be isolated.
Well done. So that inner power is what we were developing and bringing forth into the world.
Yeah.
And the New Thought tradition is the closest thing we've got in the world today to what I understand that the Miriams were practicing during the New Testament.
Exactly. So much of what I was feeling when I was receiving it was like, this is stuff I'm hearing other ways and other places. And there's a powerful lineage of New Thought, of women in the New Thought tradition.
And there is that too.
And Ruth does a lot of teaching about all of that. Yeah. So
I think we're out of time.
I think we should wrap up. Exactly. And that kind of feels like the perfect segue to ask you, is there, how can people know more about what you're doing? Do you have any classes coming up, or what are you offering these days that maybe you'd like people to know about?
Thank you. That's very kind, Claire. So my website is ruthlmillerphd.com, and everything I'm doing is on the website. Mm-hmm. But I do offer a Tuesday.
In the chat.
Thank you. A Tuesday afternoon and a Thursday afternoon meditation treatment, and online, that's available to anyone who would like to join us. And I'm on my way to Bend. I'm starting to do a class on Emma Curtis Hopkins' teachings, and I think I will be able to have a Zoom link for that. So if people want to sit in on that, we may be able to make that happen. And I know there's at least one person in our audience who will want to do that. ruthlmillerphd.com.
Thank you. I wasn't sure about the PhD part.
Yeah. And then I do speak on second and third Sundays on the coast, and those are usually recorded and put online. And I've got a couple of little classes going. So what are you seeing, Claire?
I'm seeing some great comments here in the chat. Sarah Marie says, after World War II, the value of men became about how much money they could make, and women's value came from how much they could spend.
And how pretty we could be.
It kept the economy going when the country was in peace. War is profitable. Yes, thank you. And we see farming and mom and pop shops were the core of the middle class. Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes. And Shelley shares that I just checked, and 1190 Neptune, the spiritual path. Oh, in 1190 Neptune, the spiritual path was in Aquarius. So cool. Love my Aquarius planets. That's great. And she says yes to embodiment and imbalance. And Sarah shares spiders are the symbol of the divine feminine. Yep. Yes, as we know that. John shares he's also an Aquarius, dead center of the period on February 4th. I'm an Aquarius, Sarah Marie says. And let's see some different things about that. Yes. Awesome. So good. Thank you for sharing all that. So I hope you are able to tune in and see more about if this is something that appeals to you. This is something you can have a hold of. this appeals to you. So what I can tell you for myself is because of I became, even after writing the Magdalene Path book, became very interested sort of out of the blue. Well, I was very interested in a way to pray to Magdalene that felt in alignment. I was doing other prayer practices, but they weren't connected to this lineage or this stream. And all of a sudden I woke up one morning knowing a new way to pray the rosary, not to Mother Mary, but to Mary Magdalene. And as I did the research, I found out the things that we talked about earlier, but I didn't know any of that at the time. So I got a new way to pray the rosary. So I do that every month on the 22nd. So it rotates around. So maybe some months you can't come and then other months you can. It's right now it's at 10 a.m. Pacific.
Excellent.
And so you can go to magdalenepath.com and find out more about that. And I have the Magdalene Path book, and it's just out on Audible. So if you're somebody who likes to listen to your book, go check that out on Audible. And I just yesterday created a Patreon page with some different levels. So if you're interested in doing the rosary, if you're interested in more of these kinds of dialogues, if you're interested in doing a book club, or even I curate an inner circle of like a sister circle group. Those are all on my Patreon page, which is Magdalene Path.
Magdalene Path on Patreon.
On Patreon,
If you don't know about Patreons, Patreon.
Yes.
And it's a marvelous, marvelous site to find wonderfully creative people.
Yeah, it's a way to support creators and makers. So yes. And so I just want to thank you today for kicking off this Magdalene Dialogues. This has been so awesome.
I'm delighted to have the time with you. We've been wanting to do this forever.
Yes.
So I'm glad we finally.
It's a beautiful backdrop.
Right.
It's so nice to do it in person rather than two separate Zoom streams, although that's great too.
Yeah.
So thanks for being here with us now.
All.
And I'll go ahead and let's see. Love having you here, and feel free to unmute and say goodbye if you'd like.